They thought they could humiliate the stranger, but they didn't know who was in front of them. The gang of rockers decided to have a showdown, but after a minute, they regretted it. Subscribe and write in the comments what city you are from. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a long, desolate ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast American landscape. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted in deep hues of purple and navy. Stars were just beginning to prick through the darkening expanse, but the world below remained quiet, save for the distant hum of a truck's engine somewhere far down the road. Behind the wheel of a dusty, battle-worn pickup truck sat Chuck Norris, his hands steady on the wheel, eyes sharp and unwavering as he surveyed the empty highway ahead. The night was peaceful, but experience had taught him that peace was often deceptive. He had spent his life in motion, constantly moving, constantly prepared. Tonight was no different. The truck's radio crackled softly, playing an old country tune, something slow and melancholy, the kind of song that spoke of long roads and memories best left in the rearview mirror. Chuck didn't pay much attention to the lyrics. His mind was focused on the drive, on the feel of the road beneath his tires. The dashboard clock read a little past midnight. He had been driving for hours, and while fatigue had yet to set in, he knew a short break wouldn't hurt. That was when he saw it. The flickering neon sign of a roadside bar glowing faintly in the distance like a lighthouse, guiding weary travelers. It was the only sign of civilization for miles, a lone establishment nestled in the middle of nowhere. A place where truckers, drifters, and locals alike could stop for a drink, a meal, or a moment of respite before returning to the endless road. Chuck eased off the accelerator, rolling towards the entrance. The parking lot was sparsely populated. An old semi-truck parked near the far end, a couple of rusty pickups, and a handful of motorcycles lined up near the front. The sight of the bikes gave him pause, but only for a moment. He had dealt with enough rough crowds in his time to recognize the type of people who gathered in places like this. Most of them weren't looking for trouble. But then again, some always were. He pulled into an empty spot, cut the engine, and stepped out, taking a moment to stretch his legs. The air was thick with the scent of dust and distant rain, the kind of smell that signaled a coming storm. He glanced up at the sky, saw the faintest hint of clouds rolling in from the west, then turned his attention back to the bar. The building itself was old, weathered by time and neglect. The windows were dirty, the wooden exterior faded and splintered in places. Above the entrance, a neon sign buzzed weakly, illuminating the words Big Al's Roadhouse. The red glow reflected off the puddles in the gravel lot, giving the place an almost eerie feel. Chuck didn't hesitate. He had been in worse places before. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping inside. The smell of cheap beer, grilled meat, and cigarette smoke hit him instantly, a familiar combination that told him everything he needed to know about the kind of establishment this was. It wasn't a place for the faint of heart. The interior was dimly lit, with low-hanging lights casting uneven glows over the scuffed wooden floors. A jukebox in the corner played an old rock song, barely audible over the murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. There were only a handful of patrons, an older trucker hunched over the bar nursing a whiskey, a couple of locals playing pool near the back, and then them. The rockers sat in the farthest corner, a group of men clad in worn leather jackets adorned with patches and logos from long-forgotten bands. Their presence was impossible to ignore. They spoke loudly, their voices carrying over the low hum of the room, laughing at jokes that only they found amusing. Their boots were propped up on chairs, beer bottles littering the table in front of them. Chuck didn't need to get close to know their type. They weren't bikers, not in the traditional sense. These men weren't part of a motorcycle club with codes and creeds to follow. No, these were rockers, the kind who carried themselves like they owned whatever space they occupied. They weren't here to ride. They were here to make sure everyone around them knew they were in charge. Chuck ignored them. He walked to the bar, took a seat at the counter, and nodded at the bartender, a burly man with graying hair and tired eyes. "Coffee," Chuck said simply. The bartender gave him a long look, as if assessing whether he belonged here or not, then finally nodded and turned to pour the drink. Chuck sat in silence, listening, observing. Years of experience had taught him that trouble had a way of announcing itself long before it arrived, and tonight it was coming from the corner where the rockers sat. He could feel their eyes on him, the occasional glance, the muttered words, followed by quiet laughter. He didn't need to hear what they were saying to know what was happening. They were sizing him up. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. He wasn't here to start a fight, but he knew, deep down, that he wasn't the one who would make that decision. He had seen this play out too many times before. The tension in the bar shifted. The air grew heavier, thick with the unspoken challenge that hovered between him and the men in the corner. It was only a matter of time. Chuck sat at the bar, his fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic of his coffee cup, eyes focused on nothing in particular. He was listening. Years of experience had taught him that people revealed their intentions long before they acted. A shift in tone, a change in posture, a pause between words. It was all there if you knew how to read it. And tonight, the signs were clear. Behind him, in the far corner of the bar, the rockers were getting restless. They weren't outright hostile, not yet, but the atmosphere had shifted the moment he walked in. Chuck could feel the weight of their stares pressing against his back, could hear the subtle shift in their conversation. The low murmurs, the occasional snide remark punctuated by laughter. It was the kind of bravado that came from a group that had spent too much time being the biggest threat in the room. The bartender placed the coffee in front of Chuck, wiping his hands on a rag before leaning slightly over the counter. His voice was quiet, meant for Chuck alone. "You sure you want to be here?" Chuck lifted the cup to his lips, taking a slow sip before answering. "Just passing through." The bartender glanced over Chuck's shoulder, then back at him. "Might want to keep it that way." Chuck didn't respond. He didn't need to. Behind him, a chair scraped against the floor. Heavy boots moved across the wooden planks, deliberate and unhurried. The first approach. Chuck didn't turn around. He simply waited. A large man stopped a few feet away, just outside of Chuck's peripheral vision. He was close enough that Chuck could smell the mixture of beer and cigarettes clinging to his clothes. Silence stretched between them. Then the voice came. "You lost, old man?" Chuck set his cup down, finally turning his head just enough to get a look at the man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and thick around the middle in the way that suggested strength that had long since been softened by too many years of easy victories and heavy drinking. His leather jacket bore a faded emblem on the back, some defunct band's logo. The rocker smiled, though there was no humor in it. He was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push. Chuck held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to his coffee. "No." The response was simple, dismissive, and that was enough to set things in motion. A second man joined the first, his approach even more brazen. He was leaner, younger, but his expression carried the same smug amusement. He leaned against the bar beside Chuck, too close for it to be anything but intentional. "That a fact?" the younger one said, his grin widening. "See, thing is, this ain't really a place for—" He trailed off, choosing his words carefully, giving Chuck a slow, deliberate once-over. Chuck didn't need to hear the rest of that sentence to know how it was going to end. The younger rocker smirked, but before he could push further, the voice from the corner of the bar cut through the room like a blade. "That's enough." The tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, a finality. The two rockers hesitated, then stepped aside. Chuck turned slightly, finally getting a clear look at the man who had spoken. Ray Thunder Miller. Even sitting down, Ray was an imposing figure. He had the kind of presence that commanded attention. His long, graying hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and his beard was thick but well-maintained. He wore a black leather jacket, scuffed and worn with years of use, the sleeves pushed up to reveal tattooed forearms. Unlike the others, Ray didn't look amused. He exhaled a slow breath, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table in front of him. "I don't think our friend here meant any harm." His gaze locked onto Chuck's, sharp and assessing. "Did you, cowboy?" Chuck didn't answer right away. He studied the man, taking in the details, his posture, his tone, the way the others deferred to him, the leader. Chuck knew his type well. He'd seen men like Ray before, men who had spent their lives on top, whose power came not just from strength, but from the certainty that no one had dared challenge them in a long, long time. Chuck picked up his coffee and took another sip. "No harm intended," he said finally. Ray nodded slowly, as if weighing the words. Then, with a smirk, he turned back to his men. "You see, the man's just here for coffee." He let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Ain't that something?" The tension in the room should have eased. It didn't, because even as Ray leaned back in his chair, even as he gestured for the younger rocker to step away from the bar, Chuck knew what was coming next. He had been in too many rooms like this. Ray was the kind of man who needed to be the center of the universe, the one calling the shots. Chuck's presence disrupted that. He wasn't afraid, and that made him a problem. Ray wasn't done. He picked up his beer, took a slow sip, then sat down with a heavy thud. "But you know," he said, his tone shifting, "it's funny. You see a man like you, someone who don't belong, and it makes you wonder." Chuck stayed silent. Ray's smirk widened. "Makes you wonder why he thinks he can just walk into a place like this and not show respect." The word respect hung in the air, thick with meaning. One of the rockers behind Chuck let out a low chuckle. Chuck exhaled through his nose. He had hoped this wouldn't turn into a problem, but it always did, didn't it? He pushed his coffee cup forward, tapping the rim lightly with his fingers. Then, without looking, he spoke. "I don't start trouble." There was a pause. A brief flicker of something unreadable in Ray's expression. Then, slowly, the smirk faded. Ray's jaw tightened, just slightly, and then, with deliberate intent, he reached out and knocked the coffee cup off the bar. The ceramic shattered against the floor. Silence fell over the bar. Chuck stared at the spilled coffee for a long moment, then lifted his gaze. Ray smiled. "Well, now," he murmured, "what do you think about that, cowboy?" Chuck didn't answer, because by now he already knew how this was going to end. The broken ceramic lay scattered across the floor, the coffee seeping into the worn wooden planks, forming dark, irregular stains. The air in the bar had changed. It was no longer the easy, casual bravado of men drinking together, nor was it the mild curiosity that had followed Chuck since he entered. Now there was only expectation. Ray sat back in his chair, watching, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The man enjoyed this moment, the pause before things escalated, the slow build of tension that would inevitably give way to violence. Around him, his men shifted in their seats, their movements subtle but unmistakable. Hands resting too casually on belts, shoulders angling just slightly as they adjusted their footing. They were preparing themselves the way predators do when they sense weakness. But Chuck Norris was not weak. He exhaled slowly, as if considering the situation, though in reality he had already made his decision. He had seen this play out 100 times before. A group like this, fueled by their own arrogance, wouldn't let him walk away untouched. Ray had made sure of that the moment he knocked over the coffee. The man wanted to see what he would do, wanted to see if the stranger would take the insult in silence or if he would react. Chuck wasn't one for theatrics. He simply leaned forward, reaching into his pocket, pulling out a few bills. Without a word, he placed them on the counter, a quiet acknowledgement of the coffee he never got to finish. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though he might simply stand and leave. The thought of being denied a fight, of being ignored, made one of the younger rockers chuckle under his breath. A sharp, derisive sound. That was all it took. A stool scraped against the floor. A shape moved in the edge of Chuck's vision. A man, large and heavy-set, was coming toward him from his left, the first one to test the waters. The man didn't go for a full strike. He wasn't that reckless. Instead, he gave Chuck a solid shove on the shoulder as if daring him to react. Chuck did not move. The younger rocker, emboldened by the lack of response, laughed. "Looks like the old man's got some sense," he muttered. Then the second shove came, this time harder. It was a mistake. Chuck's hand shot out, his fingers locking around the man's wrist in an iron grip. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. With a simple twist, he turned the rocker's arm inward, forcing the man to stumble forward. His knee came up, striking hard against the man's ribs, knocking the air from his lungs before he could even register what was happening. The next moment, Chuck released him and he crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. The bar fell silent. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, chaos erupted. The second man came in fast, a fist swinging for Chuck's head, but Chuck ducked, sidestepped, and brought an elbow up under the man's jaw. The impact sent the rocker sprawling backward, his body crashing against an empty table, sending beer bottles flying. Another one lunged forward, a broken pool cue in his hands, trying to use it as a weapon. Chuck caught his wrist, twisted it sharply, and the makeshift club clattered to the floor. In the same movement, Chuck drove his fist into the man's gut, then sent him sprawling to the ground with a well-placed shove. The bar was alive with movement now. The few uninvolved patrons scrambled out of the way. Tables and chairs were overturned in the frenzy. Some distant part of Chuck's mind registered the bartender ducking behind the counter, wisely removing himself from the scene. Two more rockers came at him together, thinking that numbers would give them an advantage. The first threw a wild punch, but Chuck sidestepped it, caught the man's arm mid-swing, and drove his fist into the exposed ribs. The second barely had time to react before Chuck's boot connected with his knee, sending him collapsing to the floor with a sharp cry of pain. It was over in seconds. Bodies lay groaning on the ground, some clutching their ribs, others rolling onto their backs, trying to catch their breath. The entire fight had lasted no more than a handful of heartbeats, but the result was undeniable. The rockers were beaten. And yet, Chuck knew it wasn't finished, because Ray hadn't moved. The leader of the group remained seated, watching, his expression unreadable. He had not stepped in, had not tried to join the fight. Instead, he had let his men attack first, let them test the stranger, let them lose. Now, he finally leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Chuck turned his gaze toward him, waiting. Ray let out a slow breath, then shook his head. "Well," he muttered, "looks like we got ourselves a real tough guy." Chuck said nothing. Ray straightened, rolling his shoulders as he stood. Unlike his men, there was no hesitation in his movement, no sign of nervousness or uncertainty. He was taller than Chuck, broader, a man who had spent years in fights and had come out on top more times than not. And, unlike the others, he wasn't rushing in recklessly. He reached down, grabbed a chair, and casually swung it around, setting it upright again. Then, with the same unsettling smirk, he cracked his knuckles and stepped forward. "Let's see how tough you really are." The real fight was about to begin. Ray Thunder Miller stood motionless for a long moment, rolling his shoulders as if loosening himself up for what was to come. He was in no hurry. Unlike his men, who had rushed in blindly and been swiftly taken down, Ray understood how to read an opponent. And he had been watching Chuck Norris closely. The way the stranger had moved, the way he had handled each attack with precision, without wasted motion, without hesitation, it told Ray everything he needed to know. This was no ordinary man passing through town. He wasn't some lost traveler or an unsuspecting victim who had wandered into the wrong bar at the wrong time. No, this was someone different, someone dangerous. And Ray wanted to test him. The silence in the bar stretched, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the muffled groans of the rockers who lay sprawled across the floor, struggling to regain their breath after the swift, efficient beating they had received. The few remaining patrons, truckers and locals who had wisely stayed out of the fight, watched with wide eyes, their drinks forgotten, their backs pressed against the walls, unwilling to move lest they draw attention to themselves. Chuck didn't make the first move. He remained exactly where he was, calm, steady, his breathing even. He had been in situations like this before. He knew what was coming next. Ray flexed his fingers once, then took a slow step forward. His boots made a heavy sound against the wooden floor, a measured pace, deliberate, calculated. His eyes never left Chuck's, and for a moment it seemed as though he might speak. But instead, without warning, he struck. He moved faster than a man his size should have been able to, his fist cutting through the air in a powerful arc aimed directly at Chuck's jaw. But Chuck had anticipated it. He tilted his head just slightly, letting the punch sail past by mere inches, the force of the swing disturbing the air beside him. Ray's momentum carried him forward, and Chuck used that split-second opening to counter. He drove his palm into Ray's chest, striking with enough force to send him stumbling back a step. It wasn't enough to drop him, not yet, but it was a message, a warning. Ray's smirk returned. "All right," he muttered under his breath. Then he charged. The fight exploded into motion. Ray swung again, and this time Chuck blocked the strike, catching the man's wrist in a vice-like grip. He twisted, applying pressure to the joint, but Ray was strong, stronger than the others had been. He powered through the hold, using brute strength to yank his arm free before immediately driving his knee up toward Chuck's ribs. Chuck twisted his body at the last second, absorbing the impact but lessening the damage. Pain flared through his side, but he ignored it. Pain was nothing new. Ray pressed the attack. He threw another punch, then another, his strikes heavy, forceful, relentless. Chuck dodged, sidestepped, deflected where he could, but the man was aggressive, unyielding. Unlike the others, Ray wasn't relying on intimidation. He was fighting like someone who had spent his life throwing punches and receiving them in return. A bottle shattered somewhere behind them. Someone shouted. The bartender was yelling for them to take it outside, but his voice was distant, irrelevant. Ray feinted to the left, then went for a hook to the ribs. Chuck blocked it with his forearm, then snapped forward, driving his own fist into Ray's stomach with enough force to make the bigger man grunt. Ray stumbled back, but only for a second. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then grinned. Not bad, he admitted. Then he reached down, grabbed a bar stool, and swung it. The wooden seat sliced through the air, aimed directly at Chuck's head. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the impact, but Ray wasn't finished. He twisted his grip on the stool and brought it down in a powerful overhead swing. Chuck had no choice but to step back. The stool slammed into the floor where he had been standing a second ago, the force of the impact sending splinters flying. Ray tossed the broken stool aside. "Come on," he goaded. "Thought you were tough." Chuck said nothing. Instead, he moved. He closed the distance in an instant, his foot snapping forward, striking Ray in the knee. The bigger man let out a sharp grunt as his leg buckled, and in that moment of weakness, Chuck struck again. A punch to the ribs, another to the jaw. Ray staggered, but he didn't fall. Instead, he let out a low growl, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. Then, with renewed fury, he lunged. He tackled Chuck, driving him back against the bar with the full weight of his body. Bottles rattled on the shelves behind them. Chuck felt the wood press against his back, but he didn't let the position work against him. He brought his elbow down hard on the back of Ray's neck. Once, twice. Ray's grip loosened just enough for Chuck to slip free. He spun, catching Ray by the collar of his leather jacket, and with a sharp twist of his hips, sent the man crashing over the bar counter. Ray landed with a heavy thud, knocking over bottles and glasses as he rolled onto his side. The bartender swore loudly, but neither fighter paid him any mind. Chuck stepped back, breathing evenly, his stance still solid, still unshaken. He had seen fights like this before. They were never over until the other man stayed down. And Ray wasn't staying down. The big man groaned, pushed himself up, and for a moment he just stood there, his chest rising and falling with deep, heavy breaths. Then, slowly, he looked at Chuck. The smirk was gone. Ray exhaled, shaking his head. "You should have just finished your coffee," he muttered. Then his hand darted toward his belt. A knife. The moment the blade flashed in the dim light of the bar, Chuck knew that Ray had just made his final mistake. He didn't hesitate. He moved before Ray could even bring the knife up, closing the gap between them in a single step. His hand shot out, grabbing Ray's wrist, twisting hard, forcing the weapon away. Ray let out a grunt of frustration, but he was too slow to stop what came next. Chuck struck. A sharp, precise jab to the throat, not enough to crush, but enough to stun. Ray choked, his body seizing up, and in that instant, Chuck swept his legs out from under him. Ray hit the floor hard, his back slamming against the wood. The knife clattered from his grip, spinning uselessly across the planks. For the first time since the fight began, Ray didn't get up. He just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The room was silent. The other rockers, those who were still conscious, looked between their fallen leader and Chuck, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Chuck stepped back, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned, walked back to the bar, and picked up the bills he had left earlier. He placed them down again. "Get a new cup," he said to the bartender. Then he sat down, as if nothing had happened at all. The bar was silent. The air, thick with the acrid scent of spilled alcohol and the lingering trace of cigarette smoke, carried an almost unnatural stillness. Only the occasional groan of one of the fallen rockers broke the oppressive quiet. Ray "Thunder" Miller lay sprawled on the floor, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His body ached from the punishment he had just endured, but the real wound was deeper than the bruises blooming across his ribs. It was the wound to his pride. For years he had ruled places like this, walking into bars, claiming space, commanding respect through fear alone. People knew his name, knew his reputation, and few had ever dared to challenge him. Fewer still had ever bested him. Yet now, here he was, gasping for air, staring at the ceiling, his body heavy with the weight of defeat. And the man who had done it sat calmly at the bar, as if nothing had happened at all. Chuck Norris had not gloated. He had not taunted. He had simply done what needed to be done. And that, more than anything else, was what made Ray's blood boil. The smirk that usually curled his lips was gone, replaced by something harder, something darker. He had underestimated this man, and misread him completely. Chuck wasn't just some passerby who'd wandered into the wrong place. He was something else, something Ray didn't fully understand. Ray flexed his fingers against the floor, testing his limbs, feeling the dull throb of pain radiating through his muscles. He could have let it end there, could have admitted defeat. But men like Ray didn't quit. They didn't accept losses. They took their victories no matter what it cost. With a slow, measured breath, Ray rolled onto his side, then pushed himself up. The movement was deliberate, careful, but not hesitant. He was hurt, but not finished. Chuck didn't turn to watch. He simply lifted his coffee cup, the fresh one the bartender had placed in front of him, and took a sip. Ray straightened to his full height, swaying only slightly. His knuckles flexed, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. He had strength, but strength alone hadn't worked. He had experience, but Chuck had more. So now, all that was left was one final play. His fingers twitched toward his belt. The bartender, still frozen behind the counter, saw it first. His mouth opened, as if to say something, but no words came. The gleam of the knife caught the dim light. Ray's grip was sure, practiced. He wasn't the kind of man who hesitated with a weapon in his hand. He had used it before, and he would use it now. Chuck set his cup down, his movements as slow and deliberate as they had been from the moment he walked into the bar. He didn't look surprised. He simply looked disappointed. Ray lunged. The blade cut through the air, a gleaming arc of cold steel aimed directly at Chuck's side. It was a strike meant to end things quickly, to turn the tide in an instant. But Chuck was already moving. He shifted just enough to avoid the thrust, his body flowing with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime knowing exactly how to react to danger. His hand shot out, his grip locking around Ray's wrist before the blade could redirect. A sharp twist, controlled but forceful, wrenched Ray's arm in the wrong direction. The knife clattered to the floor. Ray barely had time to register the loss of the weapon before Chuck struck. A sharp, precise jab to the throat, not enough to crush the windpipe, but enough to send shockwaves of pain through the nerves. Ray staggered back, choking, his balance faltering. Chuck didn't give him time to recover. A step forward. A powerful strike to the ribs, another to the jaw. Each blow landed with unerring accuracy, each one delivered with the same controlled force. Chuck never wasted movement, never threw wild punches. Everything had purpose. Everything was measured. Ray's body betrayed him. His legs gave out, his vision blurred, his breath came in shallow, painful gasps. His mind screamed at him to keep fighting, to get up, to do something, anything, but his body refused. His back hit the floor again, the impact sending a dull shock up his spine. He stared at the ceiling, his limbs heavy, his chest burning. It was over, and this time he knew it. Chuck stepped back, exhaling quietly, his posture as steady as it had been from the very beginning. The fight had lasted only seconds, but that was all it had taken. The other rockers, the ones still conscious, were silent. Not one of them moved. The bravado was gone, the laughter had died. They had watched their leader fall twice now, and they knew, just as well as Ray did, that there was no coming back from this. Chuck turned, his gaze settling on the bartender. "Coffee's good," he said simply. The bartender hesitated, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He was still gripping the edge of the counter as if it was the only thing keeping him steady. Chuck reached into his pocket, pulled out a few more bills, and placed them beside his cup. For the damage. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The wood creaked beneath his boots, the sound unusually loud in the hush that had fallen over the bar. He pushed open the door, stepping out into the cool night air, the scent of rain hanging heavy on the breeze. Behind him, inside the bar, Ray still lay motionless on the floor. And for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain on the wind. The storm that had been lingering on the horizon all evening had yet to break, but the signs were there. The distant rumble of thunder, the way the air seemed charged with something unseen. Chuck Norris stepped onto the worn wooden porch of Big Al's roadhouse, his boots making a hollow sound against the planks. The door swung shut behind him with a slow creak, sealing the chaos of the bar away like the final note of a song that had played its last refrain. The parking lot was quiet. The neon sign buzzed softly, its red glow casting long shadows across the gravel. The scattered motorcycles and beaten-up trucks sat in stillness, unaware of the wreckage inside. A lone street lamp flickered near the edge of the lot, its weak light illuminating the outline of Chuck's truck, waiting exactly where he had left it. For a moment, he stood there, taking in the night, his breath steady, his pulse even. The fight inside had ended exactly the way he knew it would. It had never really been a question of who would walk away. The only question had been how long it would take. He exhaled slowly, then stepped down from the porch, his pace unhurried. Behind him, inside the bar, the wreckage remained. Ray Thunder Miller had not moved. He was still on the floor, his body heavy with exhaustion, his breath coming in slow, measured drags. Around him, the other rockers were frozen in place, their eyes flicking between their fallen leader and the door Chuck had just walked through. None of them spoke. None of them made a move to stop him. The bartender, who had spent the entire ordeal gripping the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him upright, finally exhaled. He wiped a hand across his face, then turned to the mess behind him, the overturned tables, the shattered glass, the broken furniture. It looked as if a tornado had passed through. With a weary sigh, he reached for the phone. Outside, Chuck reached his truck. He pulled open the door and slid inside, the worn leather seat creaking slightly beneath his weight. The keys were still in the ignition, just as he had left them. He turned them, and the engine rumbled to life with a low, familiar growl. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, a path leading into the unknown. He had no destination in mind, no strict timeline to follow. He had long since learned that life had a way of pulling him exactly where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there. As he shifted the truck into gear, movement in the bar's doorway caught his eye. Ray had finally pulled himself up. He stood in the open doorway, his stance unsteady, his expression unreadable. The red neon light of the sign above him cast deep shadows across his face, making him look older, more worn. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. There was no anger in Ray's eyes now, no bravado, no challenge, only understanding. Ray gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Chuck returned it. Then he put the truck in drive, pressed down on the gas, and pulled away. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he left the bar behind, the neon sign shrinking in the distance, the storm still gathering in the sky. The road welcomed him once more, stretching out in front of him, endless and waiting. And, just as always, Chuck Norris kept moving forward. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more action-packed stories. Don't forget to share it with your friends and let us know what you think in the comments. Check out our other videos for more thrilling content. See you in the next one.